This is the Carlinian Studio, and I'm your host, Charles Lathrop, and today I'm going to talk about atheism, and in particular, modern secularism and sort of the claims that it kind of makes about science and religion and how they think that science and Christianity and religion in general are somehow in conflict with each other. And in some cases, some religions, they may have a point, but as far as Christianity is concerned, I've really never seen the conflict between religion and science. I don't see the conflict between Christianity and science at all. I don't see it. And I'm not sure why people think one even exists most of the time. Now, let's just get a few things out of the way, all right? The argument is made sometimes that if God existed, there would be more evidence of him in the universe. But the problem with this is, what do you accept as evidence? If you don't want to believe something, if you're determined not to believe it, you're going to turn your skepticism dial all the way up to the point where no matter what is presented to you, it's not going to be convincing evidence. It's like, how do I know that anything exists at all? How do I know that I'm not asleep and it's not all just a giant simulation? You know, if you're determined to believe something or not believe something, then you can figure out a way to justify that belief or non-belief. All right? So what would be sufficient evidence? According to science, actual science, the universe is impossible. It is physically impossible. It should not exist. That's not my opinion. That's a fact. And according to atheists, in fact, the universe is shockingly unlikely. It is unlikely to such a ludicrous degree as to make the idea of it coming into existence by chance, almost unthinkable. The impression of design on the whole universe and everything in how it works and how it functions is so completely overwhelming that rejecting the concept of a designer is almost insane. The universe is so well made and so finely crafted. Every single equation in it exactly tailored in order to support life. And it all has to come into existence from apparently nothing. It just has to appear out of nowhere. And people like Stephen Hawking have said, well, the existence of a rule like gravity could explain how the universe could have brought itself into existence. And no. Gravity doesn't bring itself into existence. That's circular reasoning. All right? It exists. And all of the science that we discover and all the science that we learn and we uncover, okay, we don't create these equations. They are pre-existing equations. These massively complicated equations that govern the universe are pre-existing to us understanding them or uncovering them. And they are all precisely tuned to allow life to exist. And all of the elements are all precisely proportioned so that there are exactly the right elements and exactly the right quantities in order to have life as we know it on the earth. And the idea that the universe could just pop into existence in exactly the formation that we see it in now by random chance and just pop into existence from no source is so ludicrous. You have more possibility. There's a greater likelihood that whenever you're doing dishes and you take a plate and you put it into a sink of soapy water, a live, fully formed squirrel will jump out of the sink. It's more likely that you'll get into your car, turn on the engine, and the engine will freeze itself into a solid block of ice in July in 90-degree weather. Okay? Those events far more likely than the physical, observable universe. If God existed, there would be more evidence of him. Really? You're walking around breathing and you don't consider that sufficient evidence to believe in God? Okay, well, you're never going to believe in God because nothing is going to convince you. It has nothing to do with science. It's very convenient to cloak what you choose to believe in rationalism, but that's all it is. It's just a cloak. It's just a veil. All right? According to physics, if something is beyond a certain probability, it never happens. Ever. All right? I've had this argument with atheists before, and they always say, oh, but there's still a chance. No. No, there isn't. There isn't a chance. If it's beyond a certain probability, it will never, ever happen. Ever. All right? You don't win the lottery 1,000,000 times in a row in the space of 10 seconds. But that is what is necessary in order for the physical universe to exist as we know it. And literally in the space of 10 seconds. Because that first 10 seconds of the universe has to happen exactly correctly in order to get the environment that we see now. In order to get a universe that supports life. It never happens. And so one of the ways that secularists like to get around this is they like to say, well, it's a multiverse. There's an infinite number of universes, and every possibility is realized in at least one universe, and therefore we just happen to live on the one that was able to support life. And the thing about that is not only is it not scientific, you can't prove it. You can't prove that the multiverse exists. Okay? But if it's impossible, it will not happen, no matter how many times you roll the dice. According to science, the physical universe cannot happen. It can't exist. It doesn't matter how many universes there are. This should not be possible. According to everything that we understand about science, it should not be. The problem is even deeper than that, because something never comes from nothing. Yet we know that the universe has a beginning. And in order to have a beginning, it has to come from something. So what does it come from? Well, it just appeared into existence. No. Or there's a multiplicity of universes. Even that doesn't solve the problem, because where does the multiplicity come from? Where does it start? How is it possible that there are a multiplicity of universes? All right? There has to be a beginning. There has to be a beginning. Eventually, there has to be a point where the buck stops. There has to be a point where this is the source. This is where everything that exists comes from. This is the point from which everything else originates. And so, there it is. That's God. Okay? And an atheist will say, well, who created God? And it's like, well, you ask me who created God, but you don't ask yourself who created random chance that made the universe. You don't ask yourself who created the universe, who created all the equations that you use for your science. You ask me who created God. Nobody created God. He's pre-existing. He has no beginning and no end. He is from outside of dimensional space and time. He doesn't have a creator. He is God. And even if he theoretically had a creator, all right, who created that one? And who created that one? And who created that one? And who created that one? No matter how far you go, eventually you have to find something that is the point from which everything else originates. And so you can say, well, you know, essentially, the fact that anything exists proves that something exists, even if our physical, observable universe is not exactly as we perceive it. And so we know that there's a beginning somewhere. We know that something exists. We know that there is an absolute truth somewhere. There is a foundation underlying everything. At some point, you have to get to the origin. And the same is true, not just of the universe, but of life itself. How did life begin? It didn't come from primordial soup. No matter how much primordial soup you mix together, it's never just going to spring from the soup. It doesn't happen. It's physically impossible for life to come from non-life. It never, ever happens. And so, according to science, the physical universe and life itself are already supernatural events. They can't be explained by the natural sciences. So modern scientists come to the Bible and they're like, oh, well, this stuff isn't physically possible. You know, it's not scientifically possible. The virgin birth, that can't happen because it's not scientifically possible. Well, of course it's not scientifically possible. Everybody already knows that. No one is confused about that. You seem to be the first person you seem to think that you're the first person who's ever thought of that. Everybody has thought of that. Everybody who has ever had any exposure to the story of the virgin birth or any of the other miraculous events that happen that are described in the Bible, they already know that this stuff is not scientifically possible. That was never something that entered into the mind of anybody who has come into contact with those things. All right? Nobody reads miraculous events in the Bible and thinks, oh, this stuff is scientifically possible. It's never happened. And so for then you to say, this stuff isn't scientifically possible, therefore it can't happen, is completely ridiculous. You're taking supernatural events and saying, oh, the supernatural is not naturally possible. Therefore, the supernatural doesn't exist. It's just another form of circular reasoning. If you want to say that the supernatural doesn't exist, just say it. Don't cloak your claims in rationalism. Don't hide it behind this veil of science. You don't want to believe supernatural events happen? Just say, I don't think supernatural events happen. Don't try to claim that because they're supernatural, meaning above the natural precludes them from existing. If you define a miracle as something that doesn't happen, surprise, surprise, anything that happens, you're not going to view it as a miracle, even if it's physically, scientifically impossible. So even if you come face to face with something that is clearly supernatural, like, all of the physical universe and life itself, you're still going to convince yourself that it's not supernatural because you've already predefined a miracle as something that doesn't happen. It's circular reasoning. All right? Now, if you don't believe that God exists, if you think that there's another explanation, if you think that, supernatural events actually don't happen and there's other natural explanations for the universe and there's other natural explanations for life and we just haven't figured out what those explanations are, fine, whatever. I'm not here today to try to convince the secularists to believe in God, okay? I'm here to explain that science has nothing to do with it. You believe in God or you don't. Science is irrelevant. Science and Christianity are not in conflict. They're playing completely different games. It's like saying that the arch rival of the Mets is the Patriots. They're not even playing the same game. They don't play by anything like the same rules. They have pretty much nothing to do with each other. All right? Now, I realize that that's not a perfect model. The situation is more complicated than that. But essentially, whenever secularists use science as a vehicle for trying to claim that God doesn't exist, pretty much everything that they're saying is non sequiturs. Nobody cares. Nobody who's a Christian, a Bible, believing Christian, actually cares about anything that you have to say, which is part of the reason that so many Christians just kind of ignore you. They don't say anything about it. They don't address your arguments because it doesn't matter. None of it matters. It's all non sequiturs. It's irrelevant. Nobody cares. Nobody's talking about your scientific discoveries because they don't matter. There was a guy, I watched a video of this neuroscientist. He was doing experiments with people who had severed corpus callosums. Half the brain is a speaking brain, the logic side of the brain, and half the brain is the nonverbal brain, the artistic side of the brain that does artistic things and doesn't talk. And so they did this experiment where they talked to each of the brains separately by using nonverbal and verbal stimulus. And they managed to get, they did their tests to make sure that they were actually getting different brains. And then they asked the brains separately whether they believed in God. And the verbal brain said that it didn't believe in God, and the nonverbal brain said that it did. And the neuroscientist is like, well, I thought this would generate this big, discussion in the theological community, but they just didn't care at all. It's like they didn't even care because the real question is like, if half of his brain believes in God and half of his brain doesn't believe in God, then what happens to him when he dies? And he thought this was this big discovery, and it's going to shatter the Christian thought about how the soul works, and it was going to be this big deal. And no, it's a non sequitur. It literally doesn't matter at all. First of all, simplest answer that any Christian with literally no training will give you, that seems like something above my pay grade. That's it. That's the end of the conversation. Listen, I don't have to have all the answers. God's the one who chooses. End of conversation. I don't have to figure it out. A scientist runs things into the ground to figure it all out. Christians don't have that problem, all right? It's above my pay grade. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And that's a perfectly legitimate answer in Christianity. If you just say, I'm not exactly sure, I'll have to do more research about that. Secondly, the Bible already deals with double-mindedness on several different occasions. And the language is not kind. Double-mindedness is not referred to in glowing terms. Okay? So this discovery of his, it's already referred to in the Bible. It's already there. We already have an answer for that. And lastly, fundamentally, all right, even if you demand an answer to this, and one is never found, and this kind of goes into answer one, where it's like, well, it's above my pay grade. But even if you say, this is not above your pay grade, like you have to deal with this, you have to find an answer, you have to deal with this, all right? It is not central to Christianity, okay? It is not the core, all right? It has nothing to do with the actual Christian religion, all right? The core of Christianity is Jesus Christ lived on earth, died on a cross, and was resurrected from the dead. All right? If you can't get rid of that, nothing else you do matters. You're a secularist. You want to disprove Christianity. You want to make whatever scientific or otherwise arguments you want to make. All right? Go wild. Go nuts. Do whatever you want to do. But if you cannot deal with the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it doesn't matter. None of it matters. It's meaningless. No one cares. Because the resurrection of Jesus Christ is Christianity. If the dead are not raised, this is what Paul says. And the Bible literally spells it out. Listen, if the dead are not raised, we, above all men, are to be pitied. All right? It is the central thing. So you might be asking yourself, how do we know that the resurrection of Jesus Christ happened? It's pretty simple. 10 of the 12 disciples went to their deaths preaching that they saw Jesus Christ resurrected from the dead. Well, how is that proof? Have you ever known humans to lie and then go to their deaths defending something that they know isn't true? No. I have made this argument to a number of atheists, and I have gotten a whole multiplicity of responses, and I'll run through some of them. Somebody said, well, people die for stupid things all the time. People die for things that aren't true all the time. Really? You don't say. Do they die for things that they themselves are in a position to know isn't true? Do they die for things that they themselves lied about and know they lied? Yeah, people die for stupid things all the time, but they die for things that they believe in. Nobody dies for something that they know isn't true. It never happens. Never, ever, never, ever. In the history of the entire species has something like that ever occurred. Now, you might say, well, they're insane. That's why they did it. It's because they're crazy. And yet, we have absolutely no record that anyone ever treated them like they were crazy. They managed to convert hundreds of thousands of people to their way of thinking. And there were 10 of them. So you mean to tell me that 10 people went insane at exactly the same time, in exactly the same way, managed to exist in human society without anyone suspecting them of insanity, and converted hundreds of thousands of people to their insanity? Really? That's your explanation? No. That doesn't fly, all right? That doesn't hold water. They weren't lying, and they weren't insane. They went to their deaths believing that he had been resurrected from the dead, that Jesus Christ had died and been resurrected. And they claimed to have seen it with their own eyes, to have been eyewitnesses of his resurrection. Which means that they believed it, and they weren't told the story by somebody else. And they went to their deaths to defend it. So they weren't lying, and they weren't crazy. So what other explanation can you find? Some secularists told me that they were simply wrong. Oh, well, they weren't lying and they weren't crazy, but they were just wrong. They were just mistaken. Yeah, the closest personal relationship of your entire life. You've known the guy for 3 years. You've pretty much spent every waking moment with him for 3 years, and he's crucified publicly. Everyone sees him dead. And then you report that he appeared to you, spoke to you, shared a meal with you, and you touched the wounds in his hands. And it wasn't actually him, it was just some other guy who kind of looked like him. You made a mistake. You just made a simple mistake. This is an explanation that an atheist actually thought was sufficient for dealing with this issue. Okay? It's not sufficient. All right? They didn't just make a mistake. They didn't just see, somebody that looked like Jesus. Oh, look, there's Jesus. Maybe he was resurrected. Let's make up an entire story about it and then go to our deaths defending it without even being sure that it's actually him. That didn't happen. All right? It didn't happen. It's inconceivable. If you want to claim, oh, well, Jesus didn't actually exist, and all the disciples didn't actually exist, and Paul didn't actually exist, and it was all just made up after the fact, you have a whole nother slew of problems to deal with. First of all, the historical evidence for the existence of Jesus Christ and his disciples is totally overwhelming. Any historian with any formal training at all will tell you the same thing that I am now saying. If you think that Jesus Christ is not a genuine historical figure, you don't know anything about history. There are a multiplicity of secular and religious sources that write about him. Sources that are actively hostile to Christianity wrote about him as a real person who really existed in the real world. I took a number of history courses in college with a professor who was an atheist. And somebody in the class once asked him, how do we know that Jesus Christ existed? And the professor's response was, well, we know that he existed because Paul wrote about him. And the student asked, well, how do we know that Paul existed? And the professor said, well, because we have his letters. His letters. Yeah, it's 90% of the New Testament. Those are letters. We know where they came from. We have them. They're historical documents. We know when they were written. We know who they were written to. And we have them separate from their inclusion in the Bible. We know when they were written. And who they were written by. And who they were written to. They don't just appear out of the ether. All right? You can't just make up history. And it's often kind of this trope, this misunderstanding of historical research and how history works. You can't just make it up. Because if you make it up, you have to convince people that it's true. And you can't fake that much evidence. You can't fake enough evidence to make a whole bunch of people who would have lived through that time period believe it. And it's like, well, they didn't convince that generation, they convinced the later generations. So if they didn't convince the generation that was supposed to have lived during the time of Jesus, because those people would have been alive during that time, they would have known that it wasn't true, and you want to say that they convinced later generations, or how much later? How far down the timeline do you think the fabrication happened? Because the further you go, the more Christian growth you have to explain without any source. You don't get to the time of Constantine, and Constantine comes out and says, oh, I have this great new religion, and now half the Roman Empire is Christian, and they just appear out of nowhere all believing this thing, and it didn't have any source, it didn't have any beginning. We know where Christianity originated. We know where it grew. We have records, extensive records of, from Roman sources, secular sources, and sources that are actively hostile to Christianity, of the growth of Christianity. We know where it originated. We know when it originated. We know everything that happened, because that's how the study of history works. You can't fake it, because if you try to, there are always people who know what the truth was. There are always people who are like, no, that didn't happen like that, or how come no one else has ever talked about this, or where's the rest of the evidence? You can't beam in an entire Christian religion into history, fabricated out of thin air, without a source, without a beginning, without any kind of explanation of where they came from. It doesn't happen, all right?